what might creative learning look like in practice? I want to talk about three particular domains of creative learning. The first, informal education, which is the first point, creative learning in school, and I'll tell some stories about creative partnerships. The second, creative learning in the community, or what I've called not schools. And finally, creative learning in the home. What does that mean in practice? So creative learning in schools, and here I'm going to talk about the Creative Partnerships project in a little bit more detail and tell you some stories about that. Creative Partnerships was set up at the beginning of the New Labour government when there was this great interest in developing a workforce for the creative economy, but also, as I was saying earlier, because there was some anxiety about the ways in which schooling was perceived as being too constricting, too kind of limiting in some ways as an offer to young people. Creative Partnerships, basically, they spent around £200 million over 9 years, 2002 to 2011. They just closed it down. And what they did basically was they worked in areas of social and economic disadvantage. So it was part of a targeted plan to engage those communities and those groups of people who are in some ways being failed by or failing the kind of offer in formal education. Artists worked with all sorts of schools in all sorts of configurations. It wasn't a program in the way that the national curriculum was a program, which in a sense is kind of part of the offer in that sense. So creative artists or creative practitioners might work with nursery schools, or they might work with 16, 17-year-olds at the other end of the spectrum. And the artists and other forms of creative practitioners, and I think I should have, if I haven't said already, I do mean to stress that although creativity is a term that is often allied to the arts and seen as being particular to it, and indeed you can't really imagine forms of artistic endeavour that aren't creative, in the context we were working in, we were very much concerned that creativity shouldn't just be limited to the arts. So we work with engineers, we work with environmental scientists. There's no particular aesthetic, arty kind of overlay necessary to this in that kind of way. So the artists would work as a sort of agent of change with the school, and in their best situations, what happened was with the creative practitioner would work with a head teacher, senior management, and they would take on a challenge for the school, and the challenge might be we're not engaging parents properly, or that there's too much time is spent inside. The curriculum isn't plastic enough for little children in that kind of way. Kids don't speak out. Their kids aren't given a voice. They could be, the problem was expressed as a sort of big kind of challenge in that kind of way. And then the creative practitioner would work with the school to develop a program of change within the school in that kind of way. So the head teacher effectively had access to quite a substantial amount of discretionary funding that they could then develop innovative, slightly off-the-wall kind of creative activities. I remember one activity I went to see, just to give you some examples, in a primary school where an artist, a builder, I don't know how to describe him, sort of a makery kind of artist, it's a very complicated world we live in, worked with parents of little children. And the parents came into school, and the artist worked with the parents, encouraging them to play with found materials, cardboard boxes, elastic bands, with the little children, in order to support the parents to develop a different kind of vocabulary of how children learnt through play. So that the parents were being kind of inducted into understanding play in that kind of way. In another secondary school I went to visit, for example, young people were used as a sort of research team in order to evaluate how creative lessons were. So the students were given a different kind of voice in order to feed back with the staff. You can imagine in that particular sort of situation, you're going to lead to a certain amount of kind of conflict. So it needs a certain kind of quality of leadership to make these kinds of things different. In many cases, in all the projects up and down the country, granted, what happened was the head teacher thought, oh, here's a chance to get a bit of extra money we can put on a school play. Oh, let's go for a visit to the local museum and do a project around the Victorians with the local Victorian archive. Fine. Because at the end of the day, you can't really mandate change. You have to kind of, but in many cases, a lot of the kind of experiences led to forms of school change, school reform. And when the funding could be systematic enough and long-term enough, which obviously can't be if it's just being cut, the funding actually led to a different quality about the ways that the teachers and the school could talk about the experiences that they were putting on offer in that kind of way. So it wasn't just a question of doing more drama, more visual art and that kind of stuff. It was to try and sort of stimulate different kinds of learning. And in terms of creative learning in the community, or what I've called not schools, I've done quite a bit of work. I used to work in an out-of-school centre, so I kind of believe in that. And I've done quite a lot of work around trying to sort of understand how people kind of invest in after-school and community arts program. In America, they tend to divide the funding for not schools, that's organised provision for young people, into kind of after-school care and into community arts kind of work. And there, the interest is on two kinds of learning. One is around kind of opportunities, a sort of second chance kind of learning, yeah, where if things didn't kind of work out in school, you got a chance to kind of find another way back into being engaged in meaningful, purposeful educational activity. And that's often why a load of arts and media activities are on offer in these kinds of centres, because they are seen and known as successful ways in which young people can be engaged in meaningful, purposeful production in kind of forms of organisation where they can kind of negotiate, work with each other and deliver and build up a sort of suite of what are often known in England as soft skills. Do you have that phrase? Okay, it's a bit ridiculous. But it's, what we know is that there's a kind of deficit in the language of talking about lots of ways in which we interact and work with each other in the workplace particularly, which are perceived to be more successfully taught in these kind of not school environments than often in school environments, where you're often asked not to take a lot of responsibility for your learning in schooling kind of situations. So here in the not school, what I call the not school world, and there's a lot of this that is very poorly funded in general. In some countries around the world, the state will support these kinds of interventions. In Scandinavia and Germany particularly, there's a long tradition of what they call social pedagogy and of investment in a youth centre, where there's a whole culture and way of working with young people in not school environments that is systematically and invested in over a long term. Where I come from, I don't know here, in the States as well, what you often have is repeated short-term investments, which are of mixed value in some respects. Kind of lucky if you can get hold of them, but it's not a systematic delivery. So in those kinds of areas, you'll often see, they'll be voluntary on the whole, and attendance and participation may be peripatetic, which can be problematic. But what you will see is an attention to other forms of kind of learning. So I talked about soft skills. There's also a great attention to personal development, on how you kind of grow as a person and how you learn to act as a kind of citizen, for lack of a better word. Not necessarily in any kind of big political kind of sense, but in terms of working with others and playing a part in community. In the States particularly, but not exclusively, there's a tradition of supporting young people into forms of entrepreneurialism, not just because of some sort of fetishism for capitalism, but also in forms of social entrepreneurialism, in terms of encouraging young people to take responsibility, to lead and develop projects. And finally, in those kinds of domains, you see much more attention to what are called cultural practices, that making, performing, producing, sharing, those kinds of experiences, where young people can feel that they are in charge, that they're making and working on things which have value for themselves and their peers. And the final area in which there's been much, much more interest in recent years, particularly as a result of the penetration of digital technologies into the home, is creative learning in the home. There's a great interest in kind of what Americans call geeking out, in the sense of those young people who get fascinated by and really kind of get into forms of interest-driven, connected learning that can go on in the home. So from getting involved from starting putting digital photographs on Facebook to kind of really getting into kind of manipulating digital work. Obviously you can make films, YouTube, And the other kind of big areas of interest in some of the education literature is around kind of gaming and participatory cultures. Gaming, it's argued particularly, involves all sorts of ways of kind of developing and supporting young people's engagement in teams, in problem solving, curiosity, and other forms of kind of deep learning. And the phrase that's been used is participatory cultures, where we now live in an era where young people have much, much more authority, autonomy to act as individuals in their own right, rather than as dependent juniors of adults in that kind of way.